Okay. Good afternoon. I am Victoria Watlington, your Great Neighborhoods Committee Chair, and we are gathering for our monthly Great Neighborhoods Committee. We'll begin with a round of introductions, first those online and then in the room, and then we'll cover our agenda. We do have two large agenda items today, and we'd like to get started. So I'll begin with my committee members who are joining. As a heads up, we do plan on having Great Neighborhoods and Economic Development Committee members today, so that we can cover the source of income protections and our city's enforcement policy, as both committees are interested in that body of work. And in addition to that, we will be covering some of our anti-displacement work and how that relates to the UDL going forward. So once again, I'm Victoria Wallington, your committee chair, and I will open the floor to committee members online to introduce themselves. I see the vice chairman has joined us.
Malcolm Graham, Vice Chairman, Chairman, Economic Development Committee.
Matt Newton, District 5 Committee Member. Great to be with you all.
Thank you. And then I also see committee members from Economic Development as well online.
Ed Driggs, District 7 Economic Development Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. And then in the room, committee members?
Renee Johnson, District 4 Committee Member.
Thank you so much. We also have a number of staff in the room, as well as our partners in this work external to the city. And so I'd like to begin with a round of introductions of staff. And then Sean, you can take us away with introductions of our guests.
Tracy Dodson, Assistant City Manager and Economic Development Director.
Anna Schloinis, City Attorney's Office.
Rebecca Hefner, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Sean Heath, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Thank
Okay.
you, Councilmember Watlington. As you referred to before, we have two agenda items today, source of income protection and city-supported housing as a follow-up conversation from the July 11th City Council meeting. And then we'll pivot into the Nest Commission update from the two co-chairs, which will actually be introduced by Deputy Director Hefner to provide a little bit of a broader perspective around anti-displacement. And if I could also take a moment to introduce our guests, Councilmember Watlington.
Yes, as well as our staff members online.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, please, if the staff online could introduce themselves, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Julia Martin with the City Manager's Office.
Good afternoon, Cherry Smith, Strategy and Budget.
All right.
Okay, thank you. And we're also joined by Kim Graham and Justin Harlow, the co-chairs for the Nest Commission, as well as Fulton Meacham from Olivian, who is part of the leadership group associated with the source of income ad hoc advisory work. Okay, we can move, advance to slide 2, please. Just a quick level set on where we're at today based on the work done over the past few months related to source of income protections in city-supported housing. Everyone will recall that in April of 2021, City Council established a source of income ad hoc advisory group, which was given a very specific charge to identify recommendations to increase acceptance of rental subsidies such as housing choice vouchers. That work really wrapped up in the December of 2021 timeframe, leading to a report out by the Source of Income Ad Hoc Advisory Group co-chairs to the Great Neighborhoods Committee on February 28th of this year, which then led to a staff-facilitated discussion at the March 28th Great Neighborhoods meeting focused specifically on recommendation number 1 coming from the ad hoc group. Recommendation 1 related specifically to the policy for city-supported housing. And on June 27th, I led a conversation in the action review meeting that evening discussing the recommendation from staff, building on the recommendation from the ad hoc advisory group itself, and then ultimately on July 11th on the business agenda, council voted and approved the policy with the exception of the enforcement provisions, with a decision made that night to defer that to a future council meeting. And staff was provided explicit direction by council on July 11th to move through a series of steps, which are summarized here on this slide. First, to evaluate and finalize the recommended policy enforcement provisions, to seek community impact, community feedback, to also seek feedback from Great Neighborhoods Committee and the Economic Development Committee, which is, that's the You Are Here Today item on this particular slide. And then ultimately in hopes of positioning this work for a vote at council on August 22nd. Moving forward, coming out of the July 11th council meeting, we felt it would be helpful to develop guiding principles that could really inform our thinking as we looked to refine the enforcement mechanism. And here on this slide is a snapshot of some of the key features that we're referring to as guiding principles here. Number 1, really frankly, is just an affirmation of some of the specific feedback that we received from council in advance of your vote on July 11th. And these features really, for all intents and purposes, are already built into the policy that you approved. But it's really just a reminder that the policy that you passed by design was meant and is very all-inclusive. So in terms of city-supported developments, it's affordable or market rate housing. In terms of TIGs, we had a number of conversations around how there are oftentimes many players involved in the tax increment grant development scenarios. So the policy makes it very clear that this policy is applicable to either the master developer and or the third-party developer, whoever is doing housing within a particular TIG district, it would all be applicable. And then, we've also teased out other specific scenarios to ensure there's transparency up front, such as if there were an incentive period associated with the TIG, for instance, that were shorter than the affordability period agreed upon, this particular policy would be applicable to the longer of those 2 periods. Moving down here on the slide, one of the things that we believe is very important as a guiding principle is to ensure there's alignment in terms of the entity that's accountable for adhering to the policy, being the entity that is in fact making the rental eligibility decisions, and also that would be the same entity that would be accountable for any fines in the event of a violation. Number 3 on the slide, it's been very important for us as we've gone through this work to ensure that any penalties for noncompliance do truly have teeth, that these penalties are a true deterrent, but at the same time not grossly disproportionate to the offense itself. And then finally, number 4, there's been an emphasis on our part to ensure that the enforcement mechanism is easily understood, straightforward, violation consequences, and flexible enough to accommodate current and future city-supported development scenarios. We think this particular item is important to provide upfront transparency so all parties involved have a clear sense for who's accountable for adhering to the policy, at what point would there be potential penalties imposed, if there are penalties imposed, how long would they be imposed, and what would the maximum penalty amounts be. Those are the sorts of things that we've really worked hard to ensure are as clear as possible in the recommendation that we'll share today. Next slide, please. We've intentionally grayed out the items on the right because we're going to pace through those one by one. But just as a starting point, as really just for reference, the original proposal that was incorporated into the July 11th request for council action, which council elected not to vote on that night, is shown here on the left. It kind of a tiered progression from a first violation to a third violation, where on one end of the spectrum, the first time through, it would trigger a written warning and mandatory compliance training, all the way to the scenarios where you have 3 or more violations, where there would be a notification of default, potentially leading to a refund of any funds provided by the city through the applicable city-supported project. So I've listed this here for reference, but really what we've embarked upon over the last 5 weeks is a lot of conversations with stakeholders in order to refine the recommendations associated with the enforcement approach to be consistent with the guiding principles that I just alluded to on the previous page. So what I'd like to do now is go through those specific enforcement recommendations, and then we'll open it up for conversation. So here, what you will see is we're sticking with the tiered approach in terms of first violation, second and third violation. And this has really been heavily shaped by a number of conversations that we've had with the leadership of the Source of Income Ad Hoc Advisory Group over the past 5. Graham from the Greater Charlotte Apartment Association, who's kind of pulling double duty today. Thank you, Kim, since she's been directly involved in the Source of Income work, and also the Nest Commission, and Fulton Meacham, head of Enlivian. So we have, if they were in the room, I hope they would smile when I say this, but we've really pushed each other very hard on these recommendations over the past 5 weeks. We've challenged each other to really be thoughtful about this. And I think it's meaningful that I can say now we've arrived at a place where we are aligned. So the recommendations that I'm about to share are supported by staff, they're supported by the 2 co-chairs of the Ad Hoc Advisory Group, and they are supported by Fulton Meacham from Enlivian. So let's just go through here, and so I can give you a sense for how we've contemplated this. Under a first violation scenario, where the Community Relations Committee of the City of Charlotte has verified a violation of the source of income policy itself, the first violation would trigger mandatory compliance training, and then the housing provider would be provided 30 days from the date of the confirmed violation to cure the violation without penalty. And our thinking there is that we know, based on conversations we've had before, that when we're using housing choice vouchers, for example, even under best circumstances, typically on average it'll be 7 to 10 days in that ballpark in order to go through the inspection process and the other requirements associated with having the housing choice voucher leased up. So this contemplates a period of time where the housing provider has 30 days to remedy the situation without penalty. If they're unable to do that, then you move into kind of phase 2 of the enforcement mechanism. And phase 2 is a 180-day period. During that 180-day period, the housing provider would be required to provide the applicant denied housing $100 a day until the violation is cured. So theoretically, a violation could be cured on the first day of that 180-day period, or it may not be cured at all. If it's not cured at all, then it would be $100 per day for 180 days. And this is an important feature because in all of these types of scenarios, the individual or the household that is damaged, so to speak, is the individual or the household that was unfairly discriminated against because of the particular rental subsidy that they hold. So in the event that the housing provider goes through that 180-day period and is unable or unwilling to remedy the situation, then what happens at the end of the 180-day period is there's a trigger, which is number 3 shown in the blue font here, where the housing provider would be subject to a maximum contractual remedy of up to $23,000 that would be payable to the city of Charlotte. And of course, you might wonder or ask, well, where did the $23,000 come from? And what we've done here, and you'll see this as I go through the other violation scenarios as well, is that dollar amount mirrors what the HUD has in place for Fair Housing Act violations, whereas HUD is, of course, referring to maximum civil penalties, with ours being related to a city policy. It's considered a maximum contractual remedy, but the dollar amount itself, the threshold level, is intended to mirror what HUD has in place for those Housing Act violations. It would be an up to amount to give us some flexibility based on facts and circumstances to apply discretion to those scenarios. I'll be able to move through, we can go to the next slide. I'll be able to move through these next 3 violation scenarios more quickly because they're very similar by design. We wanted this to be straightforward. So if you get to a 2 violations within 5 years sort of scenario, everything looks the same in terms of the provider has 30 days in order to cure the situation without penalty. If they are unable to do so, then it triggers the 180-day window where there's the $100 per day paid to the applicant if the provider is unable to remedy the situation. And then ultimately here in number 3, the one item that's different, consistent with HUD's Fair Housing Act violation parameters is that the maximum contractual remedy is up to $57,500. So you can see 2 violations results in there being more teeth associated with the policy. And then ultimately, if you get, we can go to the next slide, please. If you get into a 3 or more violations within 7 years scenario, same thing for number 1 and number 2 shown here in blue font relative to the previous scenarios. But what's different is, once again, consistent with HUD, the maximum contractual remedy moves up to $115,000. And those numbers would be subject to annual inflation adjustments. We would basically have ours move in lockstep with HUD. And you can see here, in addition to the dollar amount moving up to $115,000, a new feature in this scenario, once you get to the 3 or more violations, is the city would have the discretion to preclude the particular housing provider from future contracts, basically placing them on a debarment list. So once again, this is our attempt to have a policy that's straightforward, that has significant teeth built into it, that is reflective of market circumstances in terms of providing the 30-day window and then the 180-day window, giving developers ample time to remedy the situation, but ultimately, if those remedies do not occur, that there are sizable penalties potentially that would happen. So I'll be very brief on the next 2 slides, and then we'll come back to this one because I'm sure that's where most of the discussion will be. We can jump into just, I believe, just 2 more slides here. Next one, please. Just a reminder on implementation. Number 1 on here is consistent with the policy that you've already approved in terms of a violation of the policy occurs if a prospective residential tenant in a city-supported development is disqualified from renting a housing unit based on a refusal by the provider to consider a lawful source of income. And just again, once again, underscoring that this does not equate to it's not a mandate that housing providers accept housing choice vouchers. because we would still expect in all circumstances that the providers, the housing operators have the ability to rely on what we're referring to in a non-discriminatory manner, rental eligibility criteria. So the ability to pay rent, credit history, criminal background checks, all the housing providers would still have the ability to rely on those as objective criteria. And this is something that we discussed in advance of council approving the policy. So there's nothing new there. Number 2 and number 3 are consistent with our discussions before. Just a reminder that in the event of an alleged violation, the applicant would reach out to the city through 311 or directly to the Community Relations Committee, and the Community Relations Committee would then initiate an investigation. If there is a violation that is not remedied within that 180-day window that I mentioned in the previous scenarios, so I'm making reference here, for example, to the $23,000 contractual remedy if there's one violation that isn't fixed within 180 days, then the City of Charlotte, in terms of deciding how much up to the $23,000 amount would be appropriate in those circumstances, it would really depend on the nature of the investigation, allowing the CRC to do its work, to do its investigation, to render its findings, and based on the nature and circumstances of the violation, the degree of culpability, and a history of prior violations, those are the types of factors that would be factored into the decision on what the maximum, what the contractual remedy should be. And then very last slide here is just a reminder that there's a lot of work that the city will do in hopes of avoiding these violation scenarios at all, right? I mean, for us, success is that we do a good job of communicating the policy to housing providers in advance. We avoid gray areas, and we just avoid violations altogether. And I would just highlight a number of things that we will do kind of in the spirit of that approach. And one is that on a go-forward basis, as we enter into these contracts where this policy would be applicable, we'll have mandatory training for the housing providers, including to the extent their property management affiliates obviously directly involved in the decision-making associated with rental eligibility. We will have training that will be mandatory for them to run through. We will also ensure that all the housing providers understand up front that our Community Relations Committee will have the authority to do auditing and testing in the event that there's an alleged violation of the policy itself. And then importantly, in terms of ongoing requirements for, on a go-forward basis, any of the housing providers that need to adhere to this particular policy will be required to provide the City of Charlotte with an annual report that highlights, or more than highlights, discloses the tenant eligibility criteria they're relying upon and includes the number of units that they're renting to households with HCVs or other forms of rental subsidies. And then finally, one of the recommendations that came to us from the ad hoc group, which makes all the sense in the world, is a requirement that the housing providers preserve applicant denials and justifications for at least 24 months. And those would be all applicant denials, because we need to put the CRC in a position where if they're conducting an investigation, that they have a comparison point for reference. So if they're looking at an individual that was denied, that's a housing choice voucher, it's quite helpful for them to have access to data for individuals that have been denied that are not housing choice voucher holders or rental subsidy holders. So they can do a bit of an apples-to comparison to understand if there's been discrimination against those individuals. So that is the content that I wanted to share today. If we could go back to the slide that showed this column, I guess it would be slide number 8 in all blue font. And as I mentioned before, Kim Graham from Greater Charlotte Apartment Association and Fulton Meacham from Enlivian are both on, and I'm sure at council's discretion or interest would be more than willing to share their perspective on anything that I just covered. So with that, Councilmember Watlington, I'd be happy to entertain any questions or feedback.
Okay, wait, I see Mr. Phipps.
Yes, with respect to the CRC, is there a time limit through which they're going to be required to complete their investigation to confirm whether or not a violation has occurred?
I was seeing if Willie was in the room or on the call. I'm not aware that a lot of what the CRC will do here, or really everything they do, will be similar to the work that's conducted around Charlotte and Mecklenburg County's existing fair housing ordinances. So the work they do will be just modeled after procedures that they already have in place. I can, as a follow-up, get a direct answer to your question, because I'm not sure if there's a deadline per se that they have.
Hello, Sean, this is Willie.
Oh, thanks, Willie.
I heard the question, and that is a really good response. On a fair housing complaint, we, by law, have up to 100 days to actually investigate the complaint. I don't imagine that these complaints would take that long, so I would start off with us setting a 45-day timeline to investigate these complaints. And if we decide later after investigating some complaints that we might need additional time, we could always change that, but I would start off with a 45-day time limit.
Thank you.
And Willie, would it be fair to say that once you've rendered a decision that, you would work directly with the housing provider to, activate remedies as quickly as possible?
Absolutely. Once we do the investigation, we want to do two things. One, the discrimination or the difference in treatment, we want that to go away. And secondly, we want to attempt to make the complainant whole again, which would allow him or her to have what they would have had absent the difference in treatment because of their protected status.
Thank you, Willie.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Driggs?
Thank you. I want to say I'm fully in support here. I had two questions, and one of them was, we talked on the night we were discussing this about third parties. So I'm wondering if we enter into like a TIG agreement with an entity, and this may be an Anna question, a lawyer question, and now there's a third party with whom the city does not have a contract. So is it the responsibility of our primary contract counterparty to subordinate or to bring on board the third party so that they are liable for the penalties and the possible cancellation in the event of their non-compliance? I'm just wondering how the requirements that we placed on the primary beneficiary of a TIG, for example, are then passed on to third parties.
Yes, Councilmember Driggs, I have an answer to that, and then I'll ask Anna to help me out if I've missed the mark. But we would work in the context of a P3 scenario like a TIG directly with the developer to have it either established contractually that this particular requirement would be applicable to any housing provider in the TIG district, whether it be the master developer or a component developer, and that would be handled either contractually or through a covenant restriction, theoretically. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if there's a third-party developer in a TIG district, that third-party developer would be accountable for adhering to the policy. That third-party developer would be accountable for any violations, and that would be established up front through our relationship with the master developer.
Okay, and so that third party then becomes obligated to us and exposed to our eventual enforcement actions as a result of the contract structure. I mean, what I'm getting at here is that that third party is not immediately a party to a contract with the city, and therefore the city's ability to impose penalties on them is questionable. So you're saying we do have a contract structure that has the effect of having them accept an obligation to the city and potential enforcement actions.
So, Mr. Driggs, that's correct. It would happen during contract negotiations, but essentially the master developer would be told that one of the conditions of entering into the contract would be that any future relationship that that developer might have with a housing developer would require the third party to consent to being subject to the city's policy.
And presumably, the third party would have to, would probably participate in some of the benefit of the TIG and thereby have consideration for submitting to those requirements, I'm guessing, right? So in other words, the master developer has got this tax break and now enters into an agreement with a And I'm sorry if this is a little technical, but I'm just, having been involved in a lot of contract negotiations, want to make sure that we achieve our purpose here, which is to create a valid claim against the third party. And so, for example, if a third party fails, as described in here, it could ultimately lead to the termination of the TIG as a whole. Is that right?
I don't think that's where this new approach that's being recommended today would go. You could potentially have being precluded from future contracts, but it wouldn't be a termination of the TIG itself. With respect to your earlier question, you're making me reach back more than 20 years into Contracts 101, a peppercorn of consideration. But the consideration, I think, we obviously would have sufficient consideration with the master developer as it relates to the TIG or the CIP. That developer would then have consideration with the third party, and so it would simply be the master developer saying to the third party, as part of the transaction that you and I are engaging in, and the consideration that's being exchanged, you're agreeing to be subject to the city's source of income discrimination policy, and then whatever other indemnifications or terms they might negotiate between the two of them. But it's simply, the city says to the master developer at the time we enter into the contract, as a condition of you entering into this contract, you will require any housing developer that you might contract with to agree to be subject to this policy.
Right. I mean, I'm drawing on amateur contract 101, but just want to make sure we got the bases covered, and it sounds like we do. Appreciate that. My other question was for Ms. Graham. Is there a possibility that some of the people with whom we might want to enter into city funding agreements are going to be troubled by this? And I mean, could their lawyers, for example, say to them, you know, this is tricky, and you've got that provision in there that could blow the whole thing up. So is there any danger that we actually make our incentives less attractive to the people we want to deal with?
I think that question was for me, right, Councilman Driggs?
Yes, Ms. Graham.
Okay, so my professional opinion on this, and I will say that I had conversations with Sean, with Fulton, and with Mark Etheridge about the teeth of this proposal. My professional opinion is that the players who are going to not have a problem with this are the players who are already in the space. And so they're already subject to a number of guidelines and requirements around non-discrimination and acceptance of applicants and that sort of thing. And so my sense is that this is not going to be something that would cause them to pause. What I will say is that if we are seeking to bring in potential partners who may not have been in this space before, this probably is going to be a little bit of a challenge for them. But I'd say that the devil is in the details, and it's all about education. And I certainly advocate a very robust education over probably a 6 month to a year period of time, because it's going to take a while to get all of the many actors who are in the multifamily housing space and even in the individual rental housing space to understand the nuances of this proposal. But the people who are in the space, I don't think they will have a problem with this proposal right now.
Thank you. I think our goal should be to widen that circle, which is why I raised the question. But I do appreciate the thoroughness of the work that has been done on this. And again, I intend to support it. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any additional hands up. Given that this is a joint committee meeting, it does appear that we've got a quorum for both committees. So my question would be to legal, do we need to have a vote for Great Neighborhoods as well as economic development?
I would say no, because you haven't noticed this as an economic development committee meeting. My recollection of the mayor's charge from the July 11th meeting was simply that there be discussion, and I'll look to Sean to clarify that if need be. But since it's a meeting of the Great Neighborhoods Committee and it was noticed as a meeting of the Great Neighborhoods Committee, I think only the Great Neighborhoods Committee should take action because it's a public meeting, so.
Okay, thank you. So I will now entertain a vote.
Ms. Watlington,
Yes, ma'am?
Ms. Johnson has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Johnson. I forgot that you were in the room. Go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you, Sean, and your team for this policy. When I look at this, I do see that this policy has teeth, and we're looking at outcomes. So this is a very important policy, and I'm looking forward to supporting it. I have a question about the contract. I kind of want to piggyback off Councilmember Driggs. I wanted to define contract, because one of the penalties is that it could affect future contracting with the city. Are we talking about the subsidy, the TIG, the CIP? Is that what you mean when you say contract?
So, I mean, TIGs are maybe the best example because they're the most moving parts, but what this contemplates is that we're assigning that risk, so to speak, to the component developer if there is a third-party developer doing the housing, because that's the entity that is making the rental eligibility decisions. If there's discrimination that's occurred, it's the third-party developer in that scenario, not the master developer. So they're subject to the policy, they're subject to the fines, they're subject to the potential that they would be precluded from future contracts because they are in fact the ones that either are adhering or not adhering to the policy itself.
So if I can ask Tracy, are there financial requirements to be eligible for a TIG? I mean, a TIG is not something that your basic contractor applies for. So can
I'm
you
sorry, Councilmember Johnson, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but you asked a wonderful question that I actually have a follow-up question to what Sean just said, and I just don't want it to get lost.
Okay.
So Sean, if the third party is not the party that is engaging in or entering into a contract with the city, how then would the city know down the road whether or not a third party benefits from a future TIG if they're not the prime developer?
Well, I think just by, I'm going to look to Tracy and Anna to help me out here, but just by virtue of that component developer being within the TIG district itself, that pulls them into scope for the policy.
But at the time of the TIG being issued, you wouldn't necessarily know who all of your multifamily housing.
Correct. Yeah, and that gets back to Anna's point that it would need to be part of our contractual relationship with the master developer, that in the event of a future arrangement with a third-party component developer for multifamily housing, that this policy would be applicable to that entity.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Johnson, I apologize.
Yeah, my question was for Ms. Dotson. What are the requirements for a developer to be awarded a TIG?
So it's not really requirements of the developer per se. It's really, we look at the project as a whole. Typically, when we are entering into a negotiation with a developer, it is about achieving something with the project that has a larger public good for the project. So it's not an evaluation of, the developer's qualifications. It's more of what are we getting in the project, typically from a perspective of infrastructure, that has a greater impact to the surrounding community.
So in my experience, these have been these large projects that are awarded the TIG or the city subsidy, the projects that we're talking about. If that master developer awards or allows a third party to develop the multifamily, I don't foresee, and I could be wrong, but I don't know that third-party developer is going to be the one applying for the TIG. The policy would seem to have more teeth if we're holding the developer who we awarded the TIG to responsible for their subcontractors. So I appreciate the teeth and the intent, but practically, I think we really need to think about, is the developer who's being awarded the TIG, are they going to be held responsible for the third party? And I know that there's some question about that, but what teeth do we really have if it's not realistic that that third party developer is ever going to apply for a TIG? So it's something that I think we should think about, Sean. I know that was the concern, but how many TIGs are awarded per year, Tracy?
It varies. I think we've done 2 or 3 in the past year. But I want to clarify something for you. First of all, the master developer, when we do a TIG, the master developer makes an upfront investment. So for the example of Atrium is not in Wexford, where we did the Innovation Campus. They are not multifamily developers. So they propose to have a component of residential in their projects. We know they will not be the builders of that. But the $60 million TIG that was awarded to the Atrium and Wexford team is for upfront infrastructure. So they're making that investment upfront before they would get any money back from the city, because it's basically a tax rebate. So to have them at risk of somebody else's potential penalty when they have already made the investment on the dollars, I think could be detrimental to using TIGs as a tool. Do you have anything to add to that?
That was my concern.
I thought that was the purpose of the enforcement, is to use a TIG as a tool to discourage this type of practice in our city. So, yeah, this is, we just want to ensure that the master developer, when the master developer subcontracts, right, any of the plan, and they have a site plan, the master developer is responsible for the outcome of the development, right, to be in compliance with the site plan. So why are we dissecting this? That's a concern for me, Madam Chair. Yeah, that's a concern for me, that we are holding a third-party developer responsible who may never come to the city, who may never develop a project large enough to need a TIG. But I guess the financial piece, the fact that they will be the ones to pay the financial piece up to $23,000 and up to $57,000 is enough of a penalty that I can still support. But we need to be very careful and aware of that piece.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. I tend to agree with you, and I feel like we shouldn't be putting things in place that all of us know we can't actually enforce later on. So I'm happy to, as we go into this motion, I'm happy to support an amendment that would just strike that or send it back for review to actually get it to mean something. But that's to the pleasure of the committee. I'll entertain a motion on this item, whatever that motion may be.
I'm comfortable with sending it back, but it's up to the majority of the committee. Again, that was the discussion on the 22nd, and that's what we were asking for. But I do know that the parties were supporting this. I guess I would ask Ms. Graham and Mr. Fulton what their feelings were about that. Ms. Graham, can you give us your thoughts? I know that this was, you all discussed this before.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the question. I will say that I feel like Mark Etheridge is probably the best person to speak to this, because he's coming from a solely developer's perspective on it. I would say that, it came out of council with those questions around who's going to be responsible, right? Is it the master developer? Do we need to tie in the third-party developer? And I will honestly say that it's hard to know whether or not it's really going to be a thing until you see it in action, right? Until you see it in practice and see if it cuts muster. It's really hard. We can do things and implement things in practice or in theory, and then when they get into practice, they might not be applicable. And so I would tell you that I could go either way on that one. I would say that this is not, I mean, I would like to believe that this is not a set in stone document, right? That it's a living, breathing document that if it needs to be enhanced because the city or council or staff feels as if it doesn't have enough teeth, then we come back to it later on and we tweak it because it may need to be tweaked, right? Development evolves and development will continue to evolve. And so it may need to be tweaked 5 or 10 years from now.
If I could say a couple of things, I apologize, I'm not Gail, but I'm Fulton, and I'm having some problems with my video. But I would agree with Kim from the aspects of this is a living and breathing document, just like all policies are. And so to the extent that they can be revised in the future, I think that's an opportunity for us. But as we talked about it, I think the major thing when we're talking with Mark Etheridge as well, is the fact that is it enforceable and are we protecting the families themselves that are being damaged, right? And so, yes, I would say this policy, the way it's written, and then my understanding of the contract would be the contract is between the city and the actual master developer, but these protections would go from the master developer to any component developer. So those protections would carry through. They wouldn't just stop the master developer, they would carry through to all the other component developers, specifically the multifamily developers. So the protections will be there, and that component developer will be 100% responsible for any of these enforcement methods that we have here. That component developer will be responsible for that in the scenarios that Sean just laid out. So they'll have 30 days to remedy the situation. They'll have the $100 a day to the actual applicant that was damaged. If they don't do it within that 180-day time frame, they will have the HUD penalties of the $23,000 or the up to $23,000 at the beginning. So I feel like that it protects the city from the standpoint of making sure that what they wanted is making sure that families at the end of the day have this opportunity to live in these particular apartments, and if they don't, there are remedies to solve that. I think it still protects that within what's written today.
Madam Chairman,
Yes.
I'm ready to make a motion to approve the presentation as presented.
Okay, I've got a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and properly second. We'll go down the list. Mr. Graham?
Yes.
Mr. Phipps?
Yes.
I'm sorry, is there any discussion? Okay.
I'm sorry, I did have a couple more questions.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And when are we looking to implement this policy? When will this be implemented?
So immediately,
Immediately.
on a prospective basis. So any city-supported housing, it would be applicable on a go-forward basis immediately.
Okay, and then my last question is, how are we educating the public? One of the concerns, I remember the data provided from our CRC department, that they only had a handful of complaints in the last 40 years, whereas we get complaints almost daily on this issue. So how are we educating the public on that first of all, they should report to CRC, because the public doesn't know who's received a TIG or city financing or subsidy. So how are we letting the public know that this is not acceptable in our city and that there is a remedy for complaint?
Yeah, thank you. I should have mentioned that directly earlier, because while there's a lot that we'll do with the housing providers on the education front, we would, for a development that would be applicable to the policy, work with Willie Ratchford's team, our community engagement folks and communications folks, in order to have kind of a full full court press to get the word out, so individuals are aware
Yeah.
in the community that this policy exists and what to do if they believe that they've been discriminated against.
Yeah, individuals need to know
Right.
if a landlord denies their application strictly because of their source of income, that there is a remedy to report.
Agreed, yes.
So yes, I'll support as well, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I think it just leaves myself, and I'll just say that I appreciate the work that's been done by the ad hoc committee, Dr. Harlow and Ms. Graham, as well as others. It is a step. Certainly, I think that we could go further, but recognize that we will accept incremental progress on this one and continue to move forward. So with that, it passes unanimously, and we can move on to the next item. Thank you all for the work that you've done. For those that are Economic Development Committee members, certainly you're welcome to stay if you would like to. Otherwise, we will see you at the council meeting this evening.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Watlington. In the interest of time, we'll jump straight into the anti-displacement nest update, so I'll hand it over to Deputy Director Hefner.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to move quickly through and some intro slides here on the Neighborhood Equity and Stabilization update so that I can.
Deputy Director, please forgive me. It appears that Councilmember Newton did not go on the record with his vote. I failed to call him.
I vote yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
No problem. Go ahead, Deputy.
Thank you. A great reason to interrupt. So we have with us today Justin Harlow and Kim Graham, who are co-chairs of the NEST Commission. And this update is really for them to share their initial work plan with Great Neighborhoods Committee. I have just a few slides I'm going to run through to frame up the conversation and provide some context about how the NEST Commission's work plan fits into our overall approach. Next slide, please. As a reminder, just going back to the comprehensive plan adoption from last year, the work around anti-displacement that we're doing now is related to goals 2 and 3 of the comprehensive plan around neighborhood diversity and housing access for all. Next slide. And it is developing anti-displacement tools are a component piece of the comprehensive plan implementation strategy. So you can see that one there in yellow. That's what we're talking about today. And all the other parts and pieces that go into the implementation strategy, including the sister commission of NEST under CIP, which is the Equitable Development Commission, excuse me. Next slide. And then implementation as it relates to anti-displacement strategy, what was adopted as part of the comprehensive plan was to commission an anti-displacement stakeholder group. So that was completed. That is now the NEST Commission. Launch an anti-displacement study and recommend tools and strategies. So that is part of what the NEST Commission is charged with, and the other pieces around studying anti-displacement are ongoing. And then the last component, establish a displacement dashboard to track and update equity metrics, has also been completed. That, of course, is the displacement risk dashboard. Next slide. So you have been hearing from staff in Great Neighborhoods Committee over the past year about a lot of different parts and pieces of our anti-displacement approach. So we wanted to just put a picture in front of you of how that is all supposed to fit together. So in general, we are working to leverage data and technology in new and better ways. The displacement risk dashboard is a part of that. The work that we brought to you in your last committee meeting around looking at displacement risk by site and providing monitoring and rapid response and automated notifications and communications. All of that is a part of our broader anti-displacement approach. In addition, I'm excited to share that we just got the draft of the land acquisition analysis from our IT data team that we are looking at as part of the Housing Trust Fund tune-up. So all of those things that we talk about, they fit into this approach someplace. In addition, we are expanding our community engagement efforts as they relate specifically to anti-displacement by connecting residents to resources that can support individual households facing displacement, as well as providing new kinds of training and workshops for neighborhoods who have concerns about displacement in their neighborhood as a whole. On the right-hand side, we have a lot of programs and initiatives that we don't always talk about as anti-displacement, but that have that as part of their goal. So a lot of our affordable housing work is already an anti-displacement strategy, as well as the rent and utility assistance that the city has been providing through RAMP CLT over the last several years. Some of our jobs and workforce development and small business support has an anti-displacement approach built into it, and then a lot of the things that we do with neighborhood capacity and engagement. And then on new tools and strategies, this is where we are today. We are actively working on new ways to approach anti-displacement, especially as we look at, one, the significant changes in our housing market in Charlotte, and then two, the upcoming changes that are related to implementation of the comprehensive plan. So we've been talking with you all about the Staying in Place pilot program, a new approach to bringing all of our anti-displacement strategies together in one location. We've been building out new partnerships, and then today you'll hear from the Nest Commission about the work that they are doing and have embarked on to, over time, develop recommendations around new tools and strategies. That includes both policy and programs. Next slide. So the Nest Commission was established for a 3-year period, and they started meeting in February of 2022. They were charged with reviewing and recommending specific anti-displacement strategies and tools for protecting residents of moderate to high vulnerability of displacement. And so we are joined today by Kim Graham and Justin Harlow, who are the chairs of this 15-member commission, and they are going to share with you the initial work plan that the Nest Commission has developed and where they are headed, both over the next several months and then in the longer term for this 3-year period. But that gives you an idea of how the work of the Nest Commission fits into our broader anti-displacement approach, as well as how it's connected to implementation of the comprehensive plan. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Kim and Justin.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate the time. I'll give Kim a little break here. I know she's been in front of you all often, and so we'll give her a little break. First off, thanks for the opportunity. Happy to, and thank you for the appointment to this commission, and happy to serve as co-chair and present today to the council members that are present and to the committee. The Nest Commission is kind of broken into kind of 3 buckets. We've been meeting for about 5-6 months now, and the 15-member commission has split up into what we're calling work streams. These are the 3 work streams here: lay of the land, program improvements, and policy gaps, and then also third work stream, understanding the impacts of the UDO. So with that, we've had meetings where the commission members have self-selected really into these work groups to say, hey, what's something that as a commission member you really want to help focus on based on the area of expertise. Our 15 members have a variety of expertise around housing, around supportive services. There are a few developers on, prior elected official here. And so a lot of different things, a lot of different avenues and areas of expertise that have made the commission what it is so far. We're meeting every other month as a full commission, and then in the off months, the work groups are actually meeting and bringing on city staff and learning about what already exist. What many of us like to say, hey, what tools are already in the toolbox? And then, what else could we be adding that maybe the city hasn't considered, or what are some programs that we have done in the past that maybe could be re-implemented, looking at best practices, and what are other cities and municipalities doing as well to help meet all the goals that the council has set as priorities. So we'll go to the first lay of the land. If we can go to the next slide. So this work stream is led by Angela Ambrose, one of our commission members. She's not joining us today, so I'll take her slide. So this lay of the land really is an opportunity, is a work group that's really looking at opportunities around land acquisition and home ownership. With so much of our housing goals in the city, from trust fund to other things in the H&S department, has always been somewhat focused on rentals. And we've heard loud and clear from you all that you want more focus around home ownership. How can people participate in the wealth building process? What are some things that we need to be looking at as it relates to corporate landlordship and things like that, that's boxing people out of the home ownership process? What are some policy that maybe can be put into place there? So a lot of topics and future recommendations are going to derive into a land acquisition strategy, more deeper conversations around community land trust models and home ownership models. We just had a call, was that last week, I guess, and there was some early conversations around what does maybe bumping up the House Charlotte down payment assistance program, what does increasing those minimums look like to help people participate? So a lot of conversations happening there. We're going to be bringing in some local and national experts and reviewing some research to try to bring you all some new topics or some new ideas around policy recommendations coming out of this work stream, hopefully within the next 6 to 8 months. Next slide. So each work stream, work group has this draft work plan, generally with about somewhere between 3 to 5 kind of priority areas with estimated timeframes. And so we'll outline each of these for each of these work groups. Here's the lay of the land one right in front of you here. So we've kind of had each work group and their lead kind of target, hey, give us kind of a short term, a medium term, and a long term kind of priorities, particularly knowing this is a 3-year commitment and we're just in month number 5. And so most of the short term things are going to be really within something that we can try to target for the next fiscal year, particularly as you all enter into a new council coming on board, new budget cycle kind of starting, and some budget conversations going to be happening in the winter and the early part of the spring. And so those are those short-term things, those medium-term, more 1 to 2 years out, and then long-term kind of in a 3-year timeline. So the biggest short-term things, as you'll see here, is home ownership. And that's just, whole scale, evaluating the existing home ownership policies that exist, looking at what other municipalities are doing to help increase the amount of people that can participate in the home ownership process, and then also evaluating internally some of the permitting things that maybe impact affordable housing or create barriers to people, getting into home ownership opportunities faster. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier the institutional investors. We know that's kind of not new, but new-ish in the grand scheme. We're hearing a lot about, full communities being bought out, massive displacement because of these corporate landlords or corporate owners that are becoming landlords, buying single-family properties. So looking at provisions that could either help HOAs or also what could be done around deed restriction and things to, not try to tip the scales in the market so much, but also still allow for an opportunity where government can play a role to help its constituents in home ownership opportunities. So those are kind of 2 short-term things that we'll be tackling here really through the fall and through the winter. And then longer term, looking at land acquisition, small business opportunities as well, property ownership for small businesses beyond just renting, and in business displacement. I know often we're talking about individual families, but jobs get lost also when businesses shut down because of loss of land or increased rents and things like that. But then of course land acquisition. I know councils in the past have talked about land trust models and city participating a little bit more, and then city owned land and what can be done to capture some better practices around that, particularly for lower income, the lower AMI scale households. So this is the lay of the land work plan. This is what we're going to kind of be working through. I imagine we'll be invited back to continue giving updates to this work plan, and we look forward to it. Next slide. Awesome. So that was the lay of the land. The second work group is the one that I'm leading, program improvements and policy gaps. So this is really that bucket to discuss and hope future recommendations coming from it around rental assistance programs, housing rehab programs, kind of taking a full inventory of what do we already do? What are some things we've done, like previous pilots and things like that? How effective were they? What are ones we need to throw out? What are ones that we need to re-envision? And what are some things that other places may be doing that we're not, that might be beneficial for Charlotte residents? So it's full scope on just program improvements and policy changes. This work group is really, we're going to bring in a variety of housing experts. We've already had our first real deep dive conversation around some tax assistance things and gotten some data from the tax assessor's office. But this is just looking at policy gaps, where are things that we are allowed to do, and we know in North Carolina we can't do everything, but getting to that consistent conversation of what can we do versus what can't we, and hopefully allowing you all to take some of those recommendations and maybe put those into codifying those things. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, thank you. So same type of roadmap here, short term to medium term to long term. So short term, kind of that low hanging fruit, tax relief. What our work group has been working through is knowing that, hey, another revaluation is happening. The county's moving to 4-year cycles instead of the previous 8-year cycles. And so gathering some data around county tax relief programs, city programs, the former pilot programs, things of that nature, and also looking at tax rebates, tax freeze type of things to help with fixed income seniors or to help with residents with increase of property value, which we know is happening all around Charlotte. What that might mean for increase of property tax based on what the county and the city council decide to do with tax rates. But we see that as kind of the first step that we'll be moving with for some possible future recommendations for the upcoming budget cycle, of maybe some things that you'll hear from us back in maybe the early part of 2023 for the FY24 cycle. Also, rent assistance, exploring direct rent assistance programs. We have the trust fund, of course, and that's a developer kind of assistance program to help developers get tax credits to provide affordable housing. But we know with inflation and we know what's happening with just traditional rising rents, and there's not a lot of avenues for tenants. The landlords generally have relative free will to do what they choose as it relates to how much they charge based on what the market is allowing. But what can we be doing if we know that people are being boxed out of the home ownership space a little bit, even though we're going to tackle that with some of these institutional investors? What are some things that can be done directly as well with direct rent assistance programs from the city? Then kind of some other medium term, shorter term stuff, small landlord assistance. So this is really not talking about the big developers who build massive apartment complexes and things, but the private landlord who just, owns a home. Maybe they inherited it and they rent it out. What are we doing? What could we be doing for those type of landlords that don't necessarily qualify for some of the other programs that exist in the city's tool bank, but to incentivize private, individual, small families to keep rents affordable in homes that they are not actually living in themselves. So, grandma leaves a house to someone, they keep it, they rent it, the grandson is renting it, blah, blah, blah. How can we be helping them, whether it's, rehabbing the homes or keeping pace with development so there's not displacement there, even from a rental, so tenants can stay in there in an affordable space. Transit-oriented development is more about, we know the TOD districts are, we already know where you all have taken the direction around how do we create more density around transit lines and high employment centers. But we also know that there's a displacement impact to that. So what could be done maybe around, value capture of future developments as we talk about the Silver Line and other blue line extensions or things like that, red line, whatever transit lines that may exist in the future, how to capture that future value in the development that can later be used for rent assistance programs or anti-displacement initiatives. We know John Lewis has talked about this before. And maybe some missed opportunities that happened with the blue line. So what maybe could be done differently as planning and future things for the Silver Line come into play. And then the last step is inclusionary zoning. We know that's a thing you kind of have to tiptoe around a little bit, but really digging a little deeper into what existing towns are already doing. We know that Davidson and Chapel Hill kind of have these, special legislation for their towns. They're college towns, so it's a little different, but what could the city do possibly exploring, those types of provisions that the town of Davidson and Chapel Hill have that actually have inclusionary zoning in this state. We had some commission members talking about eminent domain and antitrust things, Sherman Act antitrust thing. How could we maybe get legally creative a little bit as this problem continues to become more dire? How do we get creative legally and push that envelope a little bit to say, hey, this is becoming a monopoly type of thing here. How could we be pushing back to help our residents? So those are our 5 in the program improvements and policy gap work plans. I think the next slide moves us to the UDO impacts. I'll let Kim take that one.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate that. So I'm going to begin by acknowledging my other work stream members. I want to point out Nadia Anderson, Katie Malumian, and Kimberly Timmons-Hampton. Our work stream is going to analyze the impacts of the Unified Development Ordinance on displacement risk and affordable housing through a long-term lens. We hope to look at topics, the impacts of short-term rentals on the overall rental market. We know that that's come up, that that's something that's in the UDO, and that has been a source of pain for this community, whether it's Airbnb or Vrbo or something else. And so, we want to begin to understand and explore those topics better. Opportunities for accessory dwelling units or ADUs, and in particular, we want to look at how ADUs can increase the more immediate availability of affordable housing. What we know is that Charlotte is lacking from available units for families who need them. We have a lot of individuals out here who could live in a 400, 500, or 600 square foot ADU that someone builds behind their home. And so what does it look like to incentivize that if we could do that? And would there be restriction periods for households that decide to do that? Would there be grants or incentives for that? And kind of what would the policy recommendations be around that? Then development bonuses for affordable housing, the impact of duplexes and triplexes being developed in neighborhood 1 zoning districts, and those defined under the Charlotte 2040 plan as lower density housing areas across Charlotte, where most of the city's residents live primarily in single family or small multifamily homes or ADUs. The work group will look at or discuss local or national experts and a review of best practices and lessons learned from various studies or programs across the nation. When we met last week, we looked at ADU programs in particular in Boston, in Austin, Texas, best practice or learnings from those jurisdictions that are closer to Charlotte. We always talk about Atlanta. We think about areas in Virginia, South Carolina, Tennessee. So we didn't see any of that, but what we understand is that there have been some newer programs that have been propped up in Raleigh, as close to us as that. So we want to look at that a little bit more and get a better understanding of how Charlotte could benefit from those types of programs. And then lastly, we're going to unpack the UDO, I would say, in terms of looking at areas of opportunity for individual homeowners and small businesses. Our work stream has talked about the fact that, we used to do charrettes in Charlotte. We used to really look practically at what a policy might do to a particular area or neighborhood service area. And so we're talking about how we can do something like that to begin helping, the average homeowner, householder to understand what the UDO looks like, and how it would apply to them, and what the cost impact would be, what a policy like, neighborhood character overlays would look like for them and impact them financially. Next slide, please. And so we too have broken our tasks down into priorities, and short, medium, and long-term goals. We're looking at ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, first. And we've already kicked that off. And so, we hope to kind of round that out by December. Looking at the research from other jurisdictions, as I mentioned, better understanding any incentives that have been created by other municipalities that are easily replicable here in Charlotte. Then we will be turning our attention to transit-oriented development, or TOD development. We want to really understand the impact of TOD policies on land values. We talked about just set-asides for affordable housing around TOD lines, which Justin's work stream will also look at as well. It's our understanding that CATS has a study that they've undertaken, and so we want to hear from CATS and understand the implications of their study on housing patterns. And so we look to have a January 2023 to June 2023 time horizon for that. And then looking at densities as kind of our medium or midstream priority. So just to understand, if or how the UDO provides for increased density options, what the overlay impacts will be of the UDO. And so that's going to be a July to December 2023 timeframe. Short-term rentals. And we also lifted up, while it's not on here, we began talking about just tiny houses, right? Could tiny villages, and we know that that's something that, City Council has tried to grapple with some in the past. But what does that look like? Could we create areas where tiny villages could be built for veterans, right? For people with VASH vouchers, or folks with supportive housing vouchers, and what that might look like. But short-term rentals, understanding other policy areas around short-term rentals, because we know that that's not something that we have. Here locally, multifamily owners, they can create whatever policies they want to create right now around short-term rentals. Do they become pain points for neighborhoods? Do they become pain points for primarily ownership neighborhoods? Do they become pain points for renter communities? So we're looking at a December 2023 time horizon for that. And then lastly, inclusionary zoning. And just what does the community feel like around that? We're going to really hear from stakeholders here locally, but also other jurisdictions around inclusionary zoning. We understand that in North Carolina, we have the rules that govern that, and whether or not we can have inclusionary zoning mandate affordable housing. But what does that really look like? And why is there pain around that particular policy? And is there anything that can be done here locally that might ease the pain, but also get at what we want, which is to increase the availability of affordable housing here locally? And we look to a January, June time horizon for that. Next slide, please. Oh, that gets us to discussions and questions. Perfect timing.
Thank you. As Tasha said, we got 15 minutes in this meeting. I see Mr. Newton's hands up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start by thanking the commission on all of their hard work. I wanted to thank you, Mr. Harlow, Ms. Graham, for your hard work as well. My question is pertaining to infrastructure needs within majority minority communities throughout our city. I really appreciate the focus of the committee within the work streams, or I'm sorry, the commission within the work streams on housing. One work stream, I think you had mentioned this, Mr. Harlow, also includes small business policies. But to the extent that we know that there are insufficiencies and equitable, so non-equitable, I guess, deficiencies of essential services and amenities, particularly as it pertains to these majority minority communities that will be experiencing increased by right development and growth in the future. What considerations are the commission giving to that? And to maybe further clarify here, those areas that don't have public transit, don't have essential infrastructure, like say sidewalks and other types of full-fledged streetscape.
So, Mr. Newton, I can take that sort of on behalf of the Nest Commission co-chairs, if I may. So there were two commissions that came out of the implementation for the comprehensive plan, one being Nest and one being the Charlotte Equitable Development Commission. And currently, that commission, the CEDC, is looking into issues around infrastructure, where we have it, where we need it, what's needed. And that commission has taken a fairly broad look at not just what we're doing, but where we're headed, similar to what the Nest Commission has done. And so the Nest Commission will not focus in specifically on that question. That'll be more of a Equitable Development Commission question, but you raise a great point around how are we ensuring that there's alignment and discussion between those various commissions. So currently we have a monthly staff meeting around the support staff for those groups to make sure that we're aligned. But I think that's a great idea to going forward, have more touch points between the commissions themselves. So thank you for raising that question.
Yeah, absolutely. With the TOD districts and our reasoning behind those, yeah, I didn't want to lose sight of the lack of that sort of essential amenities and infrastructure elsewhere, particularly given the increased by right development that I know we're going to see in the near future. And I did want to just once again thank the commission for all of their hard work. You're doing really important work, and it's very much appreciated.
Thank you, Councilmember Newton.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got some comments as well. I see the different work streams, and I will just, in the interest of time, I'll just be brief because I know I got one more council member that wants to speak. I just would encourage us to be very, very tactical. I want us to remember that while we're exploring different possibilities and what's out there, a good bit of this stuff is, if I understand it, was shared from staff prior to or at the inception of this committee. And so I just want us to be sure that we're all clear that the goal coming out of this is not necessarily just an inventory of what's out there, because I think as we talk about some of the tools that were mentioned, there's a general awareness of those, but what specifically we can do here in Charlotte. Would love to see a real root cause analysis specific to the neighborhoods that have been highlighted in our anti-displacement dashboard. Absolutely want to see the benchmarking from other cities. I think, as I said before, there's a good bit of that already exists, but what is it specific to our neighborhoods that is going on? I think that's going to require a tremendous amount of community engagement beyond the ad hoc committee, but really being in partnership with our neighborhood liaisons and our neighborhood leaders, particularly in these areas, because the value in this work is to be able to specifically deploy policies and programs that are going to impact the neighborhoods we're talking about. Specifically, when I look at the timelines of some of these items, I would encourage us to go back and review the timelines in light of the UDO. And what is most impactful to, or what is likely to be most impacted by the UDO, and line up our timeline with that. To that end, I've offered, as many of you know, an amendment to our UDO, or an amendment to our projected approval of the UDO to hold the density component of the UDO till after we've adopted an anti-displacement strategy. And so I would like to see our work, particularly out of this committee, be very, very focused on items that are going to be mitigation strategies specific to the UDO. So I'm glad to see that that's called out in one of the work streams. And I would just ask us to go back through each work stream and make sure that the timing on the initiatives we're choosing to focus on is makes sense as it relates to affecting the people who are currently in these neighborhoods. I know we're doing a lot around incentives and how we help the landlords and those kinds of things, and certainly that has a component, but we also know that ownership is the biggest defense against displacement. And so I want to see that reflected in our work. When I think about timing, there's quite a bit of things that I saw that we've been discussing for a while. I'd be interested to see what's ready now. What can we deploy on a rolling basis? Because there are some things that are go-do items, right? When we talk about increasing our down payment assistance, we've been talking about that forever. Let's just do it, right? So I don't want us to feel like we have to hold the entire suite of possibilities for one moment when there are things that we can be doing now, because certainly time is of the essence. When I look at on slide 10, there was a note about kind of benchmarking, and this is just a comment in general. We have a wealth of information I know that staff has already looked at. So let's be sure that we're leveraging that. When we talk about item 1B here, look at what other states and municipalities are doing. That feels like something that can be done relatively quickly. Certainly, we know that we're working with volunteers, but I have to believe that there is a treasure trove of information that staff has been reviewing to date. I'll leave comments for there, but certainly there is a good bit of work outlined here, and thank you for your willingness to do this work. It is a heavy lift, and to the extent that we can be of assistance, let's do this. Let's be bullish about it, because we know that things are not slowing down. So as fast as we can get quality programming and policies out the door, let's do that. We have the ability. We're sitting in the seats, and I say this to my colleagues, we are sitting in the seats to get this done. So let's not wait on it, particularly as we are making decisions for the city that we know has huge impacts to our current and our most vulnerable residents. With that, I believe let me make sure I don't have any other committee members that have comments. Ms. Johnson, I don't see you here. Do you have a comment? If not, I'll move to Mr. Winston.
I do.
Have a comment.
Okay.
Oh, Mr. Graham has a comment as well.
And I have one also, Madam Chair.
Okay, so I'll hit Mr. Graham and then Ms. Johnson.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and also want to go on record as thanking the co-chairpersons, Harlow and Graham for the extraordinary work. One, if staff can send me a handout of all the, a copy of all the handouts, I think it's really good information that's consolidated in one place. I would like to keep it as a resource. Secondly, I do agree with the chairman. Low-hanging fruits, if we can go ahead and move on some of these initiatives that we've been talking about for a while, let's move forward. Others will take a little bit longer to bake, but certainly a lot of people are watching the work, the outcomes of both committees, as those will be factors for decision-making in the near future. So no pressure, Kim and Justin, but the work that you guys are doing are really good resource work for the council that at least I will be drawing from. So please think broad and out of the box resources, anything that you think we need to do differently or to strengthen based on the task at hand. I'm very, very much interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Councilwoman Watlington. I agree. I think that this is a great presentation, and I agree with the attacking the low-hanging fruit. I would like from our legal department, if that's okay, information about inclusionary zoning, because we've almost been guided that this is illegal in the state of North Carolina. And if there are two cities that are doing that, when Mr. Harlow said college towns, I mean, we're one of the biggest college towns, I would say, as the university representative. So if that's a caveat to implementing inclusionary zoning, then I certainly think that we are more than eligible. So I would like from the legal department what the true legality of inclusionary zoning is. If you can send that to the chairs and maybe to council, that would be great, if there are indeed cities that are doing that. Also, when we talk about the incentives for the developers, if you all can research the feasibility of waiving fees for the developers, what can the city do? What's in the city's purview? So I've heard from many developers that the water fees are very expensive. Permitting fees, is that an area where the city could have a direct impact in increasing the affordability of housing in the city. So if that's something that that the group can take a look at, since these are great and innovative and out-of-the-box solutions, if you could take a look at that. I don't know if that's been done with previous council, but I would like to see that, if that's an area that we could have direct impact, along with some background and information on inclusionary zoning, the legality of that. If we can get that from the legal department. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Winston?
Thank you. I think to Ms. Johnson's question, I think maybe during my first term, I think legal did provide a pretty in-depth memo on inclusionary zoning and what is and isn't protected, or maybe that's, can be re-upped. So my question is for my friend, Dr. Harlow and Ms. Graham, and happy belated birthday, Dr. Harlow. I'm trying to be a better friend and not just see you at committee meetings and emergency dentist visits. That's my fault, man. So I appreciate the work as my colleagues have said. I'm also grateful for the timelines that you put on here. I wasn't expecting that, but I think it's very helpful considering all of the kind of balls we have up in the air around development, around anti-displacement, and just in general growth. Also given, the 3-year timeline of this commission, seated in winter of 2022 through winter of 2025, I'm assuming. My question is for the co-chairs, Ms. Graham and Dr. Harlow. It's more of a kind of a qualitative question. Do you feel that your work is being supported? Do you feel that your work is being taken seriously by staff and council members? Is there any concern that you have that, for lack of a better term, the focus on your work might be front-loaded as opposed to given, as opposed to given the attention that is needed by us as policymakers over the entirety of the life of the commission? I guess, kind of what I'm asking in other words, are there any concerns that that there will be focus taken off of your work by council under any kind of conditions?
I'll take that one, Kim. And thanks for the birthday. Love Councilman Winston. So I'll say this: Sean to Gail, Rebecca, specifically Rebecca, who's taken more calls with Kim and I. I think the staff support is there. It's overwhelming, actually. And so, no, I do not feel this way. I know there was a time when I used to feel that all these city-appointed commissions and committees were not being utilized as best that they could. I'd say for this one, it's a total of 180 for me. I mean, my thought process on, not just because I sit on it, but also because being in it for these past few months and having that level of access to Gail and Rebecca and Sean, just as a private citizen, is frankly, I think, a little unprecedented. So I think I speak for Kim with this as well. I know she's engaging in wears a lot of hats in front of you all, but the staff support is been there. Anytime we've needed to set up, different calls, get another city staff member on to come give some advice, all of those things have happened. And to Ms. Wallington's point, if I may, Madam Chair, you're right. We've had some concerns in the commission already early on around, hey, this is 3 years. Let's not drag this thing along the way we know sometimes things can, and just get information, and then, have one or two small outcomes at the end. We want this thing to be heavy outcomes based, so much in fact that every budget cycle, council member, whoever's sitting on that council, is talking about budget allocations for specific stuff, or codifying things in a true plan, not a plan that's going to sit on a shelf somewhere, but a true plan that's trackable, Mr. Winston, while we have the timeframes here to say, here's what we said we're going to do. Here's are some of the outcomes we're looking for, and here's some budget allocations attached to it. That's what success looks like for this commission. We've got some very passionate commission members who have mentioned the same thing. We're not going to wait until 2025 to just lay it all in front of a committee or lay it all in front of council. This will be ongoing, and some of it will be some things that's going to challenge you to push an envelope a little bit. And I feel personally, as a co-chair, but also someone who sat there at that table with you all, that sometimes we need that, right? How can we get the private citizens to push you a little bit, and then hopefully those recommendations are realized, and those outcomes can benefit our citizens.
Thank you, Dr. Harlow. I say this with all sincerity. I expect great things from you. To that end, you mentioned the timeline. I would love to see this reworked. And the reason I ask this is because, as you know, we've got a UDO decision looming. I'd love to see this reworked for each work stream. If you can tell us very specifically what you believe that you can deliver by the end of June 2023 and what you believe you can deliver by December 2023, it would be extremely helpful as we consider how this plays into our decisions regarding the UDO and specifically our increased density policies. Want to understand what the likelihood or realistic approach can be in regards to what we think we can deliver from a tool standpoint ahead of the UDO. So if you all are able to do that over the next week, it would be extremely appreciated. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm glad you weren't asking for an answer to that right now.
No.
But yes, no, I think this commission is very email friendly, and so I believe that something of what you're asking for can get done. We also we understand that the amendment that might be proposed next week. We're going to give you a plan. Trust me. We're going to bring a plan. It won't be by next week. We're going to present an anti-displacement plan, and we want that to work hand in hand with all the goals that this committee and the full council is setting out to do.
Thank you. Mr. Phipps.
Yes, thank you. With respect to displacement and gentrification, I know I've asked this question before, but I know we've seen a lot of, I guess, anecdotal evidence, but I'm curious as to if there are any metrics or data that's available to show what the actual displacement and gentrification has been in Charlotte. I mean, it would seem to me that, with the researchers, maybe at UNCC or whatever, I would hope that someone can provide some concrete information on where have the people transitioned to, if in fact that they're being displaced or gentrified from their neighborhoods.
Deputy, it's your.
You heard somebody say the word data, and I had that little finger twitch over my speaker button here. Thank you, Councilmember Phipps, for asking my favorite question. So
you got an answer from it.
The answer is that is a very hard thing to measure. We have an ongoing work where we're looking at that question from multiple different angles. So the INT data team has been working on that with us, as well as the folks at UNC Charlotte at the Charlotte Data Trust, because we're taking a look at all the different data sources that can give us some clues around what households are being displaced and where they're going when they move. So we're taking a look at how households that, for example, receive public assistance through food and nutrition services, how are those households moving from neighborhood to neighborhood in Charlotte? We're looking at public data on voter registration to understand how people are moving around between neighborhoods. And then the next step would be to really try to understand from those households who are moving what are some of the drivers behind that? So it is not a simple question to answer. There's a whole national practice of analyzing displacement risk and understanding displacement. This whole process would be a lot easier if we did have a simple answer to that question, but we continue to work on it and bring our partners in to take a look at it so that we can get the kind of insights that we need to craft strategies, as Chair Watlington mentioned, that are specific to any given neighborhood.
Wow, okay, well, I guess basically you're saying that it's a real hard question to answer, but it seems like it's really easy to offer up anecdotal examples and evidence of these events that's taking place. So that's what I want to. I look forward to us being able to more clearly identify the causes and the impact of such displacement in individual communities in Charlotte. So I look forward to it whenever it comes. You know. I'll give you my email address too after I'm no longer on the council. So I'd be interested in knowing, getting a good handle on that information. Thank you.
Our first vacancy, we'll give you a call.
Madam Chair, can I piggyback off that question for Rebecca? Just some suggestions. Have you, possibly, can we take a look at the eviction records, the eviction filings, the individuals who are in the hotels and the motels, and the shelters as well? Because sadly, I mean, and this might be anecdotal, but it's true, and from listening to the community, that's where people are. They're being evicted. They're in the homeless shelters. They were in Tent City. I mean, how many of those in Tent City had an apartment a year or 2 years ago? So if we can take a look at the homeless statistics, that might provide some information as well. Thank you.
Thank you. If I don't see anything else, if all hearts and minds are clear, we can go ahead and conclude, and I will see many of you later on in our council meeting. Thanks so much. Appreciate your work.